Good afternoon. I've had some sugar, so I'm ready to teach class, I guess. More or less, probably less. Got on Facebook earlier today because I'm a Gen Xer. And my good friend Marty Rizzo, who's a professor at NYU, has this post. I'm against Lent. I think there should be a season where people's gratuitous goodness is celebrated, where the miracles of human progress against disease, poverty, and uncaring nature take center stage. It's a matter of perspective. Think positive. Vernon Smith responds, I think Lent is protected for government under the right of assembly, free religion. You're free to express why you are against Lent. Your proposal is similar to what many have, what has happened in the redefinition of holidays like Columbus Day. Vernon Smith's old. He also has a Nobel Prize in economics. So that's cool. But I'm like, yeah, some years back I gave up drinking for Lent. My best friend gave up drinking with me for Lent. Some kind of friend he is. It's a true story. And the Nobel Prize winner liked that, so that made me feel happy. Okay. All right, but then I posted, oh wow, David Friedman got in on the conversation. David Friedman, of course, is Milton Friedman's son, also an economist, and he has some stuff here. It's a good opportunity to think about whether there's something you want to try to quit. Do that for a while. Some years ago, I gave up arguing climate issues on Facebook for a and never went back. This is a self-centered, right? Idea of Lent. It's focused on what Lent does for you, right? Okay. I had this post a few years back about fasts, and I'm going to read that to you because I can. It's my class, but I'll add this now. A fast is subversive to technocratic Keynesianism. Always back to the econ with this guy. By adopting increased frugality for a season, we not only demonstrate sympathy and solidarity with the least of these, but we also cause the real prices of essential goods to fall, benefiting those with low incomes most. Fasting for buying a yacht won't help those with low incomes, but fasting for meat will. Right? If you choose to engage in a fast of any sort, right, you're purchasing fewer of those resources, which decreases the demand for that good or service. A decrease in demand, ceteris paribus, will cause the price of that good to fall, leaving more available to those who are poor relative to you, to have more access to it. So in real terms, in economic terms, fasting helps the least of these. Right? Of course, oftentimes we want to impose the fasting on the least. You should be fasting. You don't have any bread anyway. I had this post a few years back at Adam Smith Works, which is a spinoff or part of the Project at Liberty Fund. Right. So I wrote this in March 2020. It said, to become willing to share bread with the hungry and enter into solidarity with the suffering of others requires the activation of what Adam Smith calls sympathy. The ability to enter into another person's sentiments through imagining oneself in her place. Now, of course, I bring all this up because Lent begins on Wednesday, right? Where's the party Tuesday? That's what I want to know. Where's it? You guys planning a big party? Is there a fat party Tuesday? A fat Tuesday party coming up? Is there one? Where is it? I want to pull like a Bill Murray and crash that thing. So you're nowhere near as cool as Bill Murray. Christians around the world, and I wrote this after Lent began, entered into a season of Lent, a season of fasting on February. The month-long fast of Ramadan is a few weeks away for Muslims, and Jewish observance of Pesach, 8 days of fasting from leavening, begins in early April. Among the reasons for fasting are to consecrate oneself, to enter into solidarity with others, to become contrite, to commemorate past sufferings and miracles, and to have more to share with others. Isaiah says, is this not the fast I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house when you see the naked to cover him and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? It was a It was an opportunity not necessarily just to cleanse yourself, but actually to do things for other people. To become willing to share bread with the hungry and to enter into solidarity with the suffering of others requires the activation of what Adam Smith calls sympathy. The ability to enter into another person's sentiments through imagining oneself in her place. Smith provides some wisdom about why sympathy for the suffering or grieving is usually difficult for us. Smith says, but on the contrary, when we condole with our friends in their afflictions, how little do we feel in comparison of what they feel? We sit down by them, we look at them, and while they relate to us the circumstances of their misfortune, perhaps somebody they love died, we listen to them with gravity and attention. But while their narration is every moment interrupted by those natural bursts of passion, they're crying, which often seem almost to choke them in the midst of it. How far are the languid emotions of our hearts, you lazy sympathizer, from keeping time to the transports of theirs? We may be sensible at the same time that their passion is natural and no greater than what we ourselves might feel upon the like occasion. So we're thinking, oh, we're putting ourselves in their point of view. This is Smithian sympathy. We may even inwardly reproach ourselves with our own want of sensibility, and perhaps on that account work ourselves up into an artificial sympathy, which, however, when it is raised, is always the slightest and most transitory imaginable. Oh, I feel so grieved with you. You might even cry with the person and walk away, wipe your eyes, and go on smiling. Generally, as soon as we have left the room, vanishes and is gone forever. Nature, it seems, when she's loaded us with our own sorrows, thought that they were enough. You got enough of your own problems, and therefore it did not command us to take any further share in those of others than what was necessary to prompt us to relieve them. That passage reminds me of Job's friends, supposedly consoling him, but unable to truly enter into his suffering, even after 7 days sitting with him in silence. It's very difficult to enter into the suffering of others. Adam Smith even suggests that the one who suffers will try to conceal or downplay the extent of his suffering to make it easier for others to sympathize with him. In order to produce this concord, as nature teaches the spectators to assume the circumstances of the person principally concerned, so she teaches this last in some measure to assume those of the spectators. As they're continually placing themselves in his situation, and thence conceiving emotions similar to what he feels, so he is as constantly placing himself in theirs, and thence conceiving some degree of that coolness about his own fortune with which he is sensible that they will view it, as they are constantly considering what they themselves would feel if they actually were the sufferers. So he is as constantly led to imagine in what manner he would be affected if he was only one of the spectators of his own situation. As their sympathy makes them look at it in some measure with his eyes, so his sympathy makes him look at it in some measure with theirs, especially when in their presence and acting under their observation. And as the reflected passion, which he thus conceives, is much weaker than the original one, it necessarily abates the violence of what he felt before he came into their presence, before he began to recollect in what manner they would be affected by it, and view his situation in this candid and impartial light. So we might expect that those with whom we desire to sympathize might not reveal to us the full extent of their situations. By fasting, by feeling some common pain, though, it can only be a pain of the body. We bring ourselves closer to them and free them from having to perform so strenuously for our approbation. In this season of fasting, we can allow our impartial spectators to see more, to see better, and to enter more deeply into the suffering and sentiment of others. We can live the commitments of our religions. We can also use Adam Smith to see things we otherwise would turn away from and try to avoid sympathizing with. We can learn to so sympathize that we are motivated towards meaningful action, solidarity, generosity, and a greater fellow feeling. The idea is similar to that in an exchange, where there's a price that the buyer is willing to pay and a price that the seller is willing to sell at. And through sympathy, those come closer to one another, and more exchanges are able to obtain as a result. We can enter into somebody else's grief more if they withhold some of that grief. We can also enter into their grief more the more we are willing to absorb some of the harm or the pain that is suffered by sharing that grief with someone else. Economics isn't the study of prices and money alone. Economics is the study of human behavior and exchange relationships, and that includes exchanges of sympathies. So it's important to see how we can transfer what we understand through studying markets to our interactions in the social realm as well. Okay, let's see, who's got the Fed watching for today? It should be, today is 28th, so it should be Seth. Seth is not here. See if you posted one to this. That was Tyler's. No, okay, back. See if anybody turn in one here. I think that's still Natasha's. Oh, all right. So no news about the Fed. Anybody have news they want to share about the Fed? Anything you noticed? News from the Fed? In the meantime, I posted week 8 stuff. On Friday, you're going to take your midterm, covers chapters 1 through 9 and 20. We will meet today and Wednesday to continue the chapters 9, 10, 11, mostly through chapter 9. And hope to get into maybe a little bit of chapter 11. We'll see how well I do. Probably not that well, given my track record. I had a couple of students who had to take the exam early because they're traveling later this week. And so I had to create the exam. There is no written portion. There is only a multiple choice question and a short essay question. You're going to do all that though in this room with your laptops. And so you do that on Friday. The idea is that you will spend, I think I've given 30 or 40 minutes for the multiple choice and then 20 minutes for the written essay. And the multiple choice, I think there's 25 or 30 questions pulled from a pool of like 150 questions. So each person will get a different set of questions roughly. And then there are a couple of different essay questions that you'll get one of those on your exam randomly assigned to you. The essay questions come from your supplemental readings. So make sure that you've done all the supplemental readings to date, and you'll only have the time in class to do it. All right, questions? Anybody else need to take the exam before Friday? No? Good. I wanted to catch up on a couple of items that I hadn't talked about as much as I thought that I had. We talked a little bit about population last week, right? And we say population change affects a variable that we give the letter N. I want to give you some background. Back in the early 1800s, Thomas Robert Malthus writes a book about population growth. I think it's an essay on population. And Malthus does something rather simple. He says, you know, if you've got 2 people right now and they have babies, there's going to be more people next year. Right? So population grows. But it does not grow in a linear fashion. Rather, Malthus says that population grows exponentially. Right? And back in his day in particular, the average couple of 2 people had on average more than 2 new people. Right? It grew faster than that. They had many children. Malthus says, okay, so if you've got population growing exponentially, and food production is also increasing. We are becoming better at producing food. but the increase in food production is a function of people and land, and land is becoming more scarce, then food growth, production can only grow linearly. So then, at this point, all these people up here get dead. Right? In the long run, the population can only grow at the same rate as food production. And so he had this result saying that everybody's going to die, right? Or that we're going to get to a point in time when a lot of people are going to starve because there's just not going to be enough food. He said that there is one constant variable in this formula, and he called that the passion of the sexes. Just, people are going to have babies. It's going to happen. Now, of course, there was not access to contraceptives at the time, or not as great of access to contraceptives. He said there's two ways of dealing with this. There's the positive check, and there is the preventative check. What he means by positive, right, is the same as positive analysis as compared to normative analysis. Not like, oh, that's good, that's positive. No, it just says this is just causal relations. The positive check is death. So what keeps population in check? Why is there not a growth in the population rate? Just because people die. The preventative check would be birth control. Now, back in the day, before there was easy access to birth control, before the pill, what would be another form of birth control? What is a reasonable form of birth control? Well, in Malthus's point of view, waiting longer to get married is one possible route. Okay? So you can wait until you're older before you get married, and then you'll have fewer kids as a result. However, he also holds another variable constant. What might that be? The male sex drive. Right? Which may or may not be different from the female sex drive, but to Malthus it was different. Right? He presumed that the male sex drive was going to be what it was. That men were going to want to have sex. Okay? And so what can be done about that? Well, if you can't do anything about the fact that men are going to have a high demand for sex, but you want to delay marriage, what's the alternative? What is a close substitute? Prostitution. Prostitution is a close substitute. Because if you have prostitution, then multiple men are all having sex with the same woman, so there can't be as many new babies as a result. So this is a positive form of birth control. Now, understand, Malthus was a preacher. Okay. But he says this is what could happen. We can encourage prostitution as a result. Okay, that seems a little weird to us. As birth control did become more available, there was a great controversy about whether or not to use it, whether or not to allow birth control. This debate was raging in Great Britain in the early 1800s. John Stuart Mill got involved. Charles Darwin got involved in this debate all at the same time. There were a couple of people who got arrested for sharing literature on contraceptives. And said, here's good ways to prevent having babies. And they got thrown in jail for it because it was considered lewd. Right? The literature on birth control was considered akin to pornography in the day, and they were thrown in jail for it. In this lawsuit, the people who were trying to share information about birth control sent a letter to Charles Darwin saying, hey, we're trying to say that using birth control is a good thing, that it should be allowed. Would you mind testifying? And Charles Darwin said, I'm old and sick, I'm not coming. Also, I disagree with you. Darwin said, I don't think that people should have access to birth control. Well, why not? Well, there's two reasons why we might not want people to have access to birth control. If the poor have access to birth control, right, then how much more will the rich have access to birth control? If the rich have access to birth control, now you have to add an assumption here. The added assumption is that the rich are rich based on merit. That there's some reason why they are rich. They are obviously better people than the poor. This is not what I think, this was the attitude at the time. They are higher quality people. By allowing higher quality people access to birth control, because they're the only ones who'll be able to afford it, we will only have lower quality people having people. So the overall quality of people in England will deteriorate. We will end up with low quality people and no high quality people. They literally called it race suicide. They called it race suicide. Darwin said, that's a bad idea. It's also a bad idea to give birth control to the poor. And Darwin is actually being a little bit more egalitarian. He was saying we shouldn't allow birth control for the poor because some of those poor actually are better people than some of the rich. I've met some of each kind of person, and I can tell you this is true. So then, we should allow the poor to have as many children as they want. We should allow the wealthy to have as many children as want. It wasn't really about poor or rich. It was really about upper class and lower class. We should allow the upper class to have as many children as they want. We should allow the lower class to have as many children as they want. What we should not allow is charity. We should not allow charity. We should not allow people to help take care of and keep alive low quality people. Instead, we should just let whoever can survive, survive, and those that can't, not. As a result, we will end up with a higher quality level of people. It's charity that is the problem, from Darwin's point of view. In other words, well, what happens to all the other people? The poor, the starving. They get dead. Goodbye. I mean, pretty consistent with what else we understand about Darwin's theory regarding the survival of the fittest. Right? Survival of the fittest for people, too. Right? All of this became super important, in part because it's born out of economics. It's a part of the story of economics going all the way back to the early 1800s. And it develops into what we remember as eugenics. Eugenics was a very popular theory throughout the educated world up until, I don't know, late 1945 for some odd reason or other. That's when they opened the death camps in Germany and realized this is bad. How common were eugenic ideas? In the 1920s, the Church of England was debating about whether or not to allow their parishioners to use contraceptives. They had a big conference at a palace they call Lambeth. This was my first dissertation idea. It never got written. Had this big discussion at Lambeth Palace. And in that discussion, the question was, well, should we allow our parishioners to use contraceptives or not? And the story broke down very similarly to the story with Darwin. Half of them said, yes, we should allow our parishioners to use contraceptives, right? That way the low quality parishioners won't have as many children. The others said, no, we should not allow high quality contraceptives because if we do, then our high quality parishioners won't have as many children. It was all based on, right, the same racist ideas. Both the for contraceptive and the against contraceptive points of view were arguing based on eugenics arguments. This was throughout all of our intellectual debates at the time. Now, any of you remember the Scopes monkey trial? You ever hear this story, the Scopes monkey trial? This was when evangelicals in America came out against the teaching of evolution in textbooks. They went to trial in Tennessee in the early 1900s, 1930s, I think, is about when this happened, right? And all the evangelicals were against the teaching of evolution because they didn't want to believe that we came from monkeys. That's their point of view, right? None of the evangelicals who came out against this textbook came out against it for another reason. Eugenics was completely in and throughout the entire textbook. None of the arguments against using this textbook had anything to do with the eugenic arguments in it. They all thought those eugenic arguments were fine. It was the fact that it didn't concord with their theology about creation that they didn't like it. Okay, fun times. Next. Another way to think about people is to think about brains. Brains. How do you think about people? People have 2 hands and 1 mouth. If we think about people as increasing productivity overall, rather than increasing consumption, then we have a different attitude towards people. Michael Clemens has his paper, $1 Trillion Bills on the Sidewalk, that says that if we got rid of all preventions for mobility of individuals, we had open borders for people to migrate wherever they wanted to go, global GDP would triple. Global GDP would triple. My God, that's amazing. That's a lot of GDP, right? There's a lot of inefficiencies out there that are the consequence of preventions on migration. I'm not telling you what your ethics should be. I'm just telling you what the opportunity costs are. Okay. We've been talking about economic growth. And last time we added this E term. Right? And E we said is our effective worker. K, little k then, if we redo all of our analysis and make little k be equal to k over L times E, right, then we will say that this is capital per effective worker, instead of just capital per worker. K over L is capital per worker. Little k in this case would be capital per effective worker. So you can have the same number of people, but you're going to want to have more capital because each worker is more productive. Now, if we get into the steady state, what would be the growth rate of K in the steady state? You should have an immediate response to this. What is the growth rate of K in the steady state in every one of our models? 0. Once we're in the steady state, K doesn't change. The growth rate remains constant. What about Y? What about output? Output in this model is output per effective worker. How does output change in the steady state? Output per effective worker. How does that change in the steady state? Again, 0. What if I rearrange this equation? What if I just get Y over L? Then on the other side, I would have little y and E, right? Little y and E. What is this growth rate in the steady state? In this case, that would be G. And that's where that G term enters in, technology growth. Remember, we have our our graph for the Y, okay, output, capital, savings as a function of capital. And then we have our rate of depreciation, but it's not just depreciation, it's depreciation plus population plus technological growth. Okay. And when we are in the steady state, this G term is describing the growth rate per effective worker. So then output per worker is growing at rate G. Well, what if I also move the L to the other side? Y equals little y times E times L. At what rate does real output grow? In that case, it grows at the rate of population growth and technological growth. So then, this shows that the real quality of life for actual individuals is rate G. The output per worker, the quality of life for each average worker, is growing at rate G. That's technological growth. This is baking technological growth into this model. Earlier in the Cowan-Tabarrok presentation of this model, right? They say that you have your function here, this function and this function, and instead of baking a population growth and technological growth into this, instead they have this A term. And A boosts up, and actually this is capital Y and capital K. They don't do per effective worker in their analysis, right? So then this boosts this up. This does the same thing, but shows that growth in this line instead, showing an improvement in the quality of life for the average individual at rate G. If we didn't put it here, if we put it here instead, then we would say that this thing is moving up at rate G. Or we translate that over to the production possibility frontier, right? We would take it, good X and good Y. Our ability to produce stuff as we go into the future is increasing at rate G. You follow all that? What it is that we're trying to say with all of this? What about consumption? How do we think about consumption? Well, remember that consumption is output at the steady state minus the cost related to maintaining the capital that we had before. If we take the first derivative with respect to capital, then we get the marginal productivity of capital here minus, right, B minus N minus G. The capital term drops off, equals to 0. If we're maximizing consumption, so D C over D K star, you get this term. And rearranging this, we say marginal propensity or productivity of capital should be equal to all of these positively. We can take minus D equals N plus G. Right. So how much, so what is consumption at the golden rule level? Well, it is the capital level at which we find the golden rule level of capital, and we take the marginal propensity to consume minus N plus G, and that is our level of consumption in the golden rule level. So we solve for our golden rule, our maximizing golden rule level of quantity, level of economic growth in this set of terms. I'm not saying that well. Hopefully you can read the textbook and understand what I just said. The point of walking through the entire solar growth model from start to finish is basically that what matters? Growth. Technological growth matters. That is what leads to long-term economic growth. Without technological growth, we would all converge, wouldn't we? Wouldn't we all converge to the same quality of life? We have our production function, and there are some societies that have, and we're going to assume that, let's call this constant, right? If everybody were aiming for the golden rule level of output, golden rule quantity of capital, right? Then we'd all end up in the same place eventually. We'd all end up here, at the same level of effective output per worker. Everybody's quality of life would be the same everywhere. But we don't see that, do we? We don't see everybody around the world having the same quality of life. Instead, what we observe is divergence, big time, which is the title of a paper by Lant Pritchett. Lant Pritchett was a co-author on that paper about trillion-dollar bills left on the sidewalk about how global GDP would triple if we allowed for migration. He also wrote a book called Let Their People Come, about how arguments against migration fall apart when looked at carefully. How do we observe divergence? Here's how you observe divergence. You pull up a map of Korea. Korea. Technical map of Korea. Okay. And you find a line in Korea. Here you have North Korea, and here you have South Korea. And you look at it at nighttime, and here there are many, 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 many lights, and here there is darkness. It's brilliant at night in South Carolina. I already got the beach on my mind. In South Korea, it's dark in North Korea. Anywhere else in the world where we could look and see North Korea, South, or something like that? A big divergence across some sort of artificial line? Right? Places along the Mexican-American border, where on one side of the border it's wealthy, safe, clean. The other side of the border it's not as wealthy, not as safe, not as clean. Although I'll tell you what, those North Koreans would kill to get into Mexico. So we have a problem because we say, well, everybody should be converging. Ideas are free. Ideas flow freely. I can share an idea with you. You have that idea, and I still have that idea. I didn't really lose anything. Maybe if we're competitors, I lose some profits. But in terms of my actual quality of life, we're both made better off, right? Ideas are free. Why aren't ideas freely flowing or freely adopted? These are the kinds of issues that prompt the readings, right, that I assigned by Easterly and McCloskey. Why is it that some countries aren't catching up? We've had a long time, a lot of opportunities to do it. That work also touches on work by a guy named Douglas North, right? won a Nobel Prize in economics, taught at Washington University in St. Louis for a long time. Another guy you might find interesting on this is Darren Acemoglu. Also continues to write. I think I told a joke about Acemoglu last time, we'll tell it again. I mean, I would tell it again, I don't care about it. Why is it that a barber in El Salvador earns $1 per haircut, but you move that same guy to Texas and he can charge $15 per haircut? Is the barber any different in El Salvador from what he is in Texas? So why is it that he can earn $15 in Texas per haircut?
People will pay $15?
People will pay $15. Why will people pay $15?
They don't have access to the dollar haircut.
Okay, so we should allow, flights between El Salvador and Texas so that people get $1 haircuts. Now, it's because the people who are already in Texas already have a lot more money. And the opportunity cost for them cutting their own hair is a lot higher. Barbers' haircuts climb with the incomes of the people that they serve. You try to get a haircut in Washington, D.C., and it's like $30 to $40. Wealthier cities have higher costs for haircuts. You guys are all thinking, who gets a $10, $15 haircut? Okay. Exhibit A. Amongst other important issues are institutions and culture and rhetoric. That's all stuff that I've asked you to look at in the readings. Okay. There's a bit on endogenous growth. Maybe I'll come back to some of that next time. In the meantime, I'm going to do a little bit, 5 minutes worth. We're getting us into chapter 11 in the second half of our textbook. We're going to really do like the Keynesian sort of macro model from here on through. Okay. We're going to provide challenges to the overall Keynesian point of view. All right. Monetarism is going to come up. Austrian theory will also come up. I hope to maybe present an augmented Austrian theory that Dr. McClure and Dr. Thomas were developing, and that I'm now co-authoring with Dr. McClure on. Try to think about how business cycles emerge. But the puzzle is this. If we have a growth trend over time, we've described that as primarily being a consequence of technological growth. I'm fine with that for now. But we know that growth does not proceed according to trend. Instead, growth goes like this. We call this the business cycle. If I were to put this on a production possibility frontier, and let's make it dynamic, right? Y over time. This is our maximum sustainable level of growth. Over time, it's increasing, but I'm going to make it a dynamic version, right? Sometimes we are producing at a quantity below our sustainable level of production. Sometimes we're producing above our sustainable level of production. We fluctuate. And that's how we end up with a business cycle that looks like this. Similarly, we can show the same phenomenon. Oops. I want to put output over here, and I want to put the price level over here. I want to make this actually percent change in real GDP growth, right? And here we will build our old macro model: long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply. And we can show a business cycle as being time periods when the economy is either to the left or right of our maximum sustainable level of production. Sometimes we're doing better than our long-run aggregate supply sometimes are doing worse than. These are expansions. These are recessions, right? The next steps, what we want to do next is interrogate our aggregate demand curve. What is the aggregate demand curve? Where does it really come from? What does it really mean? We're going to build something called the ISLM model to talk about that. I'm not a huge fan, but we're going to work within the constraints that we have in our text. Okay, we're going to ask, what is the short-run aggregate supply curve? Where does it come from? What does it mean? We've already kind of dealt with the long-run aggregate supply curve. We dealt with the long-run aggregate supply curve because it is related to the solar growth model. It is about economic growth over time. In a dynamic version of this picture, right? This is not a certain given point. This is a growth rate. 3% growth year over year. This is a dynamic picture. I'm not putting this level of output. I'm putting the growth rate of output. I'm not putting this price level. I'm putting the change in the price level. That's what I put inflation. So these are both rate of change terms on the axis. Well, in that case, then this also needs to be a rate of change term. And so does this. And we got into the whole business of doing rate of change terms when we took m times v equals p times y, applied Euler's theorem and said percent change money plus percent change in velocity is equal to percent change in price plus percent change in output. Here we have the monetary growth rate. Here we have the change in velocity. Here we have inflation. And here we have real GDP growth. And we'll go from there. See you on Wednesday.